go through the book, which is more than what I can say in the case of other releases, for the simple reason that after a long time I find something that is readable and endable. Our problem is we start on a book and then something distracts us and then we keep a flyleaf and that's the end of the story. I like it for another different reason, that it just fits into what I call flight reading. Most of us who get to read only during flights, because at the end of the day when you've finished everything, completed everything, the wife says, it's my time. So there goes your reading. So flight reading is something that's very convenient, and anything beyond a number of pages tends to remain unread. Everybody has commented on the dialogic style, and the first school of the dialogic way of narration was of course attributed to Athens and Socrates. But very few are aware, and I have to go home and check up the dates, that we had in India the first organized religion, the first non-state organization. I am saying this in front of Meghnad Desai. The first non-state organization that is known, recorded, emanated from here, and its variants would be appearing in every non-state organization, like the bureaucracy, like the church, like the Islamic State. It's appearing. And what is this? You have a voluntary organization. People volunteer to come. People would like to come, so there's a screening process. With the entry screening process determination, you are taken in as a novitiate, a novice, for a particular amount of time, an IAS probationer, an IPS probationer. After you qualify, you are taken into the regular scheme of things. You get graded promotions, you are transferable anywhere. I am referring to the Buddhist church. The first non-state organization, and this nobody talks about it. Every other organization in the world, from the, as I mentioned, from the Catholic state, from the Roman church, to the bureaucracy, to the Marxist party, follows more or less the same structure. Whether they took it from it or did it on their own or came to the same conclusion, I would not be able to say. That's for Vidyut and others to find out. Now, one of the reasons for the stunning popularity of Buddhism was not only that very oversimplified appeal against the caste system. Frankly, the caste system hadn't solidified till then. Economics, the economic means of production, didn't allow the caste system to solidify by the 7th century, 6th century BC. It's a lot of a retrospective analysis. Yes, there were systems that were conflicting, a certain amount of inegalitarianism that was creeping in, and a certain requirement for upward mobility, for freedom within occupational choice, that led to, let us say, more enterprising groups coming up. You know that the most enterprising group that came and joined Buddhism was known as Shrestha. Until today, that got stamped with the business community, the entrepreneur. We do not differentiate between the entrepreneur and the maker of wealth. Till today, we call them Setha, Shrestha, Sethi, Settar in South, in Chettiar in Tamil Nadu. The word for entrepreneur continues even now. So anyway, coming back to the Buddhist church, the first most interesting way was their narration of how they got across the usually obfuscating philosophy. And the best book in this regard that is referred are not the suttas. Please avoid them. Like the Upanishads, I read them but once and stay miles away. The suttas, the Tripitaka, and these are various ways, they're only for name dropping. I have to go plow through almost everything, that's what I'm saying. To give you a headache. The best narrative on Buddhism and the most communicative one was the questions of Raja Milinda. Raja Milinda's questions. And that explains in his conversational style, what is the problem, what is what I say. This is another part of the dialogic narrative that needs to be covered in greater detail, because India needs to claim her position, not because some people think that for different reasons, but because it makes sense that we need to claim that space back. And there are these non-colonial, post-colonial focus areas were simply dropping out. Now, this dialogic form Amit has followed, and more important, there is a generational divide where the heart of India is concerned. There are consignment of all, let us say, if I may use the word Hindu text or sacred text, to something that you do after 50 or 60. And well, everybody knows more or less what happened, especially after all the television and film narratives, film stories. But even so, it's kind of old-fashioned. You have to get this because we live and breathe one of the narratives. And that's the difference between the two. Don't lump them together. Amit is absolutely right when he says that, or he hints at, that Mahabharata preceded the Ramayana. Every historian knows that. Because the Mahabharata contains a lot of elements that are usually prescribed as primitive. Now, primitive is a word that analysts, anthropologists, and others avoid because it's a pejorative word. It contains the seeds of our society as they existed in an undiluted form, as was where was, no cover-up. Now, the question is, how do you relate this to the generation that is going to inherit the world when you leave? Are they going to get interested, or are they going to consign it to one corner saying, it is a patrimony which we keep under wraps and sort of look like the Torah, we look at a distance and do a little bit of worship, but anyway, move on, man, it doesn't really matter in our lives. The question of bringing this relevance into our daily lives is brought out by two young chaps. As he said, Jayanto said, and Amit did it purposely on a lot of rum. So this could be another Ramayana. So it's cool. But he focuses through this, through the, let us say, through the spirits that waft after, through the wisdom that is induced by the Holy Spirit. And he comes across the liberty and then questions. But there are uncanny insights, and that's where uncanny insights, where he grasps it and gets it all. But as I said, when the young are concerned and are not concerned about footnote and sub-footnote and reference to the main text, it will suffice. So, to that extent, without the understanding of what we have, there's no big deal in having a great tradition if it goes off with passing generations or is consigned as a Brahmanical text, a Hindu text. My religion is very personal, like most sensible people. I would not like to make much public ado about what I believe in. He has gone on and used first-class, first-rate modern language from the idiom of almost the millennial generation, though he just before them, I guess, mutants, clones, and others. I heard the word ninja turtle and the mutants for my son, who's about 33 now. So this one he has put in, therefore bringing the relevance at every point. He has questioned or tried to explain monogamy, polygamy, a very uncomfortable question of how Kunti could have 5 different sources, etc., etc. And of course, there are people who jump to the conclusion that if you had 5, therefore you must be modern, and therefore you must be liberated, and therefore you must be. That again is the ascription of value judgment that screws up clarity of thought. Whether you are monogamist or polygamist by choice or by nature or by genetic pull, it's a different matter. We can take calls on that, but that the narrative, and I come to the narrative now, the narrative of Mahabharata is, in my humble opinion, the grand supra-narrative of the Indian people. It has to be understood first as the narrative of the Indian people. It is a Magna Carta of India. It is not a Magna Carta that was signed under pressure by King John. It's a living Magna Carta that was fused and debated upon for about, again, my studies, historians place it exactly within 400 to 500 years. between the 2nd century BC and the 4th century AD. I mean, they're very clear about dates. I had to suffer linear history. I believe in linearity of history, but to understand India, you have to de-linearize yourself. So, the strict European linearity of history, where it's all marked on a table with benchmark, is one way of understanding it. But here we belong to a civilization that thinks in terms of circles, continuous circles, like a concertina wire. So if you stretch out a concertina wire, you get bumps. You can't get. So our narrative is spiral. This is the narrative. It is spiral not because we are confused or not because we go around in circles, which is also a fact, we do, but because it was required. Imagine, ladies and gentlemen, another cultural federalism, I'm repeating, another cultural federalism in the world, another subcontinent in the world, where you have distinctly counted about 24, 26 different ethnic groups, languages, mega languages, with 600 dialects, hundreds of castes, hundreds of colors, every shape and color under the sun, coming together and believing in the same destiny, in the same history, unless you force it on them. Everybody shares the same history and everything, unless it's sort of forced upon them. And without the aid of a central Vatican, a Mecca, a church, or any disciplinary authority. How did it come about? Now this is the 24th year of my life and tossing with that question when I've been very serious. And one of the answers lies in what we call the layering of narratives. In Mahabharata, we find the first wisps of it captured not in any story, but in explanations of Patanjali and Panini. First wisps of the stories are coming up. Krishna being mentioned, here being mentioned, and not in their deified form as superheroes, etc. Amit, I don't know how much has gone into it, but his second uncanny thing about the interpolation and the interjection, extrapolation of the Gita, a 5-hour discourse when you're about to go in for battle. This has struck everyone. But the positioning of the discourse was done rather deliberately and happened over a period of many years, where the centrality of the argument had to be maintained in spite of the plurality of stories. So the centrality of it had to be posited somewhere, and nothing could be more exciting than the position of the most excited thing when they come to that confrontation after so much provocation. So the defining moment was there, and it's definitely an interlocution. Everybody knows it. He's not supposed to know. He's not. He's spent his life managing things and making money, hopefully. And so this is one those who have toiled and not it. Now coming back to the Magna Carta, that is this. These stories of the Mahabharata, as I said, appear first in the late Upanishadic age, that's around 500, 600 BC. So it refutes the basic fact that the Mahabharata was a Brahmanical response to the Buddhist challenge. Well, chronologically, yes, the Mahabharata emerged in a mature form when Buddhism had sort of reached its peak. So therefore, linear historians would look upon it as a challenge, the response. As I said, in terms of time, yes. But the beginnings, the sutras of the Mahabharata begin even before Buddha is born. That means these are floating tales that were captured, interwoven, kept in for entertainment. The Mahabharata starts with as a tale of the Sutars, Ram Sutar or Chutars, the carpenters, charioteers and others. It's a balladic tale, it's a ballad. And this ballad is an oral narrative, like the Rig Veda and everything. These are all oral narratives that were captured, refined into later syntax, grammar, rhyme, meter. These are oral narratives, and the first time we hear about it is around the 2nd century BC, maybe 3rd, when we come across it as a group of poems known as Jaya. And from the Jaya, this story then becomes snowballing, taking in other sub-stories, windows, sub-windows, this, that, other side stories that are equally interesting, and rolls itself up from the Jaya to the Bharata, or Bharata. Bharata. It's a very twist of this thing, whether you put an A or an A. Like most people don't know that it's not Bharatanatyam, it's Bharatanatyam. It's Bharatanatyam. So we are and the Sanskrit A and A, you got Subify, there are 5 of them. So it's not Ashoka, it's Ashoka. That small A that never comes in English. So Mahabharata, Jaya, Bharata, Bharata, Mahabharata. It takes its journey over a period. The most mature period is between the 2nd century BC or the 3rd century BC and ends around the 3rd century, blossoms in the early Gupta period, 4th century. Now forget history. Can you tell another narrative of another religion, assuming that it is linked to the religion? It's linked to the people. It's linked to the people of Hindustan, to the people of the subcontinent. It's not essentially what I would call a one religious narrative. The parts of its performance are contributed in economic terms, in participatory terms with people of many religions. Even if you look at even Mahabharata, you'll find that the Ravan festival is contributed by many castes and communities and many religions. The essential point is that the Mahabharata remains a living tradition, or similes or metaphors, or Vibhishan, Shikhandi, this, that we use words so freely that we never check back, like Shakespeare, oh God, this came from here, this came from here. We believe, read it and live it. The Bible is the nearest that we have, but the inheritors of the Bible do not use it the way we do. So it's not one frozen narrative or a story that we sort of add on, but we have imbibed it, it is interjected with our blood, and even the entire linguistic formulations are all built around metaphors and similes that come from there. So Mahabharata as the grand narrative of India requires to be studied as the grand narrative with an open mind. The openness of mind is a different thing, as Amit has said and others have said. The openness would entail a certain degree of risk-taking because in our business, unless you footnote it and prove it, you'll be flicked off like a fly. So that is there, and you have a whole bunch of Sanskritists sitting over it as if they own the damn thing. A whole lot of Brahmanical obscurantists sitting over it and think they own what is called the common narrative of India just because their forefathers played around with it. Okay, we have to unshackle it and bring it for discourse. A society lives on discourse, not on lectures. A society lives through dialogue, discourse, discord. And Mahabharata is the best example of how it lives through it. It has to be a living process where a platform is offered for arguments and then taken to what I call a draft proposition. The plurality of India, the life of India, the divergences of India that are held together by, apart from a grand narrative, a grand tradition of debate and discourse. And I'm so glad that he has been able to highlight it. So it is in this light, apart from the interpretation that he brings about, where makes meaning to the young generation. As Mao Zedong had said in our times when everything was Mao in Calcutta Presidency College, the world belongs to you. He was addressing the youth. The world belongs to us. Ultimately, it belongs to you. So to those who are the ultimate inheritors of the world, unless they own up, all our exhilarations, all our raptures about our own inheritance will not mind. Thank you, Amit, for bringing it one step closer. Thank you.